Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Hobo with a Shotgun from 2011. Now, this requires a lot of meta conversation, and frankly, that's going to be the majority of the discussion about this movie. Because, well, for one, this is a continuation of Horror October, given that the first episode of this series that I did for October I thought was going to land in September, ended up landing in October. Didn't want to reorder the whole thing. So anyway, this is the last one for October. So talking about Hobo with a Shotgun requires a lot of discussion about genre film and cinema history and budgets and like sort of a weirdly high amount of literary analysis for what amounts to, some of the quote unquote most lowbrow of cinema that there is. Hobo with the Shotgun is a grindhouse slash like exploitation film. And trying to explain that to its fullest extent is something I'm not qualified or capable of talking about. Mostly because it's not generally my thing. But it's an important relationship between this and the rise of budget horror in the 70s and 80s and horror in general that has come after this, because so many films can end up drawing inspiration or stylings or these other things from things that were made 50 plus years ago sometimes. So Hobo with a Shotgun is very much a sort of a send up to the gruesome low budget exploitation films, particularly of the 70s and early 80s, and to a lesser extent some of the exploitation resurgence that happened in sort of, I want to say, the 2000s, 90s and 2000s with things like Trauma, which I've talked about before. I think I've talked about before. Yeah, it's at least come up in passing. And at its core, these movies were originally about sort of making things on very low budgets and riding on basically shock value. Now, we could have a whole discussion towards what draws people to these sorts of things, whether it's a genuine interest in watching like gruesome things, or if it's sort of a morbid curiosity, or it's an ironic, detached viewing, or some sort of cathartic. There's a whole, you could make a whole YouTube show about nothing but that sort of like psychological and philosophical and cultural analysis. We're not going to get into all of that too much. We're going to get into it a little, as you may expect from this show at this point. But at its core, this movie is trying to modernize and also in some ways poke fun at the origins of exploitation films and slasher and grindhouse films, where the sort of evolution from these extremely low budget like and things that relied basically on nothing more than sex appeal and gore. This starts to, it does the same things but frames them sometimes in ways that allows you to remember that like ultimately it's not taking it very seriously. And that was to some extent true, depending on the era and the movie you're talking about, of the original sort of releases that happened in those bygone eras. So visually and everything about how this movie was made is trying to sort of ape that styling. It has a very oversaturated color palette, has very stylistic and sometimes very ugly, deliberately ugly use of very strong lighting, whether normal lighting or colored lighting for stylistic purposes. It uses extensive not animatronics, but prop. It's basically prop stuff, and makeup and all these sort of really over the top, gory, gruesome things are all done to such an extent that they're obviously not supposed to be taken seriously. And that is something that differs a little bit from those bygone eras when a lot of those visual absurdities had more to do with the budget and less to do with being deliberately, again, depends on movie to movie, but less to do deliberately on wanting to not be completely real. It was more that, what they could afford, what they could make on an extremely slim budget was red food dye in cornstarch water, and those sorts of things. And the unrealism, in a way, became its own genre. So this movie leans into the absurdity factor to a much greater extent and to a much more honest sort of approach to, we know exactly what this is. That really interests me because if you look at this only as a piece of cinematic art, it's terrible. Visually it's ugly. The acting is deliberately bad. The sets and costumes are cheap as all hell. The dialogue and the story is basically nothing. And it has no meaningful conclusion. It just sort of suddenly ends. And those are all in outside of any context that makes this a terrible film. But within the context of what it is related to, this is a really impressive way of reintroducing the grindhouse genre to a time period where grindhouse has no place. Because in our current era, and for the last, let's say, 15 years especially, it has become progressively easier to make really good film on really low budgets. So to have something that deliberately looks so bad is not a case of incompetence or lack of resources. It's a case of deliberate effort to make a piece of art in the form of a previous piece of art. So while I was watching it, and sometimes not infrequently looking away from it because it's not really my cup of tea, I still find that fascinating because of what it represents in terms of cinematic history and the ways that it tries to adapt and show that a genre that has no reason to exist anymore still has value in existing. Now, as for this movie in particular, this is also an attached, it's sort of attached to other things in a very direct way as well. It's been a few years since I watched Grindhouse, the movie Grindhouse from 2007, which is co-directed by Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino. They are unabashed fans of the extremely low budget genres and Grindhouse in particular, and have talked somewhat extensively, as far as I'm aware, about their love for it and appreciation for it and what they think can be learned cinematically from it. So Grindhouse was a really interesting way for people with relatively big names at the time to, and bigger names now arguably, to revive a genre they loved so much. So there haven't been that many grindhouse style films since, and a lot of the ones that do exist have been attached to Grindhouse from 2007. This movie started out as I understand it, there is an interlude in Grindhouse 2007 that includes sort of a short trailer style clip for this movie that didn't exist because it was, basically just somebody's idea. I believe they basically, Tarantino and Rodriguez, let people submit their own fan films in the style to be the fan film trailers to be submitted as possible options for them to include in the film, or include in the theatrical releases in various locations. And there's a whole discussion to be had about how Grindhouse itself was actually released, because structurally it was released different ways several times. So actually having seen any given one of these faux trailers was sort of a crapshoot in the first place. But this was one of those trailers. One of the other trailers was the trailer for Machete, of which obviously that spawned not one but multiple real films. I actually haven't watched them. That is one of those things. The Grindhouse is one of those things that, like, super hardcore gore stuff is something I have to be in a certain mood for, like a certain mood to tolerate, I should say. And so one of these days I'll get around to watching Machete, but that is one of the few other notable sort of in the same genre films that has come out in the last 15 years, possibly even longer. And there are a handful here and there, and it is a genre that gets the occasional sort of indie darling thing as well. There's a few that have come out in the last few years that I can't remember the names of because I haven't watched them, but every once in a while, something sort of slips through, and especially with the rise of more online filmmaking and stuff like that, it's become easier to make and find those sorts of things if it's something you're into. It doesn't have to get its own theatrical release. So as far as like further analysis of this film, there isn't that much specific for me to say, because everything that's bad about it, bad air quotes, is a deliberate effort. And some of it is just like, we don't need to put in the effort here because our artistic aim seems to be to not be good. It's to make something that is appropriate for the thing that the kind of art that we're trying to make, this sort of dead art. So obviously, if you're not already tolerant of the sort of content and quality that is present in those sorts of films, in grindhouse films and slasher films and horror films from the 70s and early 80s, then obviously just don't even bother watching this. I think that's perfectly valid. And while I'm not the biggest fan of it, like I said, I find it interesting at the very least. And this does skew into sort of the realm of, it's both trying to imitate it and also to some extent have a self-awareness and a mocking tone at times. So the deliberateness with which things are bad and the occasional, not necessarily fourth wall breaks, but distracting amounts of comedic effort, where you can say, as an analyst of the movie, you can say, okay, they didn't do that in a deliberate effort to do that in the film. They did that only in order to make fun of X thing, or to ensure that tonally this sticks to a relatively more comedic tone, that you're supposed to not be taking it seriously. You're supposed to not be enjoying it, even in a weird way. That, art is not always meant to be enjoyed. It's sometimes just meant to be absorbed. And so, like, everything about that and everything about their seeming apparent effort. By the way, this is directed by Jason Eisner, who is a name I don't know, but apparently has a few credits, mostly in the sort of like low budget film area. It's it's for what it is, for what it seems to be attempting to be. It's very, very good, and it is also profoundly Canadian. So obviously the main character is played by Rutger Hauer, who's not Canadian. He's Dutch, I think, and has just had a long career after being in Blade Runner. He basically did almost exclusively sort of low budget films for a very long time, and I think he passed away a few years ago. But having him present and at the forefront of a film like this is a fascinating pick in the first place, especially as a very old man. But then there are some casting decisions that are visible if you're very familiar with sort of cultural touchstones in Canadian cinema. There are people you are going to recognize, and also just they make no effort to, like, this low budget. It's deliberate bad acting at many times, and so nobody's trying to hide accents either. So there are some very audible Canadian accents as well, and I sort of just love that as an extra touch. I think especially because this is thought of as a genre that is generally very American. So having it be very Canadian instead is, while never saying that it's Canadian, it's supposed to be, it's never supposed to be anywhere specific, but it seems to be more American than Canadian. It's just that just adds a little extra touch to me that makes me chuckle. If this isn't what you're looking for, you're gonna hate it. If this is what you're looking for, I think it's really solid. And if you're just looking for like a weird tangent to take in some cinematic analysis, just to like take your brain to a different place for a little while, I think it's a fascinating place to look and to learn. And it's just genuinely has some very amusing elements to it, and some great scenes and even some great quotes. Anyway, I'm glad I didn't run out of things to talk about with this. I have the capability to ramble on a tangent for a very long time, but this was pretty solid. I was pleasantly surprised by the end at how much I actually enjoyed it, because there are aspects of this film that I'm not super tolerant of. So I'm glad it came through to a lot more than the sum of its parts. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.